We don't know a lot about John Doe, and that's by his own design. He gave himself an anonymous name and even cut off his own fingerprints to keep his identity a secret. We can assume that he was born sometime in the late 1950s based on his appearance in 1995 when the bodies of his first victims were found. The year 95 is written clearly on the label of multiple crime scene photographs. That's right, John Doe was a boomer. We don't know where he grew up, but we can assume that he was American based on his accent. He was brought up religious and even attended Catholic schools in the 60s and 70s. He was raised by a single alcoholic mother who instilled the fear of God into him at an early age. There was a specific instance in middle school where John had an ongoing flirtation with a neighbor girl named Marcy McFadden, who his mom referred to as a filthy whore. One day, John watched Marcy change from his bathroom window. When his mother caught him, she beat him with a wooden spoon and sent him to bed without dinner. His tumultuous childhood left him angry at his lot in life and disgusted by the world around him. He leaned on his Christian faith and his God to get him through it. He eventually became a religious fanatic, determined to get the world's attention by punishing the people that he deemed to be sinners in gruesome, over-the-top ways. But the question remains, who is John Doe really? Well, according to him,
it doesn't matter who I am. Who I am means absolutely nothing.
However, that doesn't make a very interesting episode of horror history, does it? So let's dig into the past that John never wanted anyone to find. John put his ideology before himself. He viewed himself as a messenger and martyr, and like many religious fanatics throughout history, he used his beliefs to justify his horrific violence. He aimed to keep his identity under wraps, but there is still a lot that we can learn about him based on the things he wrote and the things he read. If you want to know more about John Doe's ideology, the 7 deadly sins, and the contents of his journals, stick around to the end of this video. This video is sponsored by PDS Debt. Welcome to Horror History, where the only sin we are guilty of is the pride we take in our work, and sometimes wrath. Today I'm profiling John Doe from David Fincher's 1995 surprise smash hit movie, Se7en. No, I'm not gonna stop pronouncing it like that, even though the joke is no longer funny. If you're not familiar, John Doe used the 7 deadly sins as a framework for a killing spree that he committed in 1 week's time in 1995. He targeted people who committed the sins in order to punish them and bring attention to the prevalence and acceptance of sin in the world around him. Screenwriter Andrew Kevin Walker has stated in interviews that he was inspired to write the story after moving from suburban Pennsylvania to New York City in the late 80s. This was back when the crack cocaine epidemic was on the rise, and in his words, you would never go to Times Square without being careful. It was a culture shock to Walker. He imagined a character who was highly oversensitively attuned to the injustices of the city, and his train of thought is what spawned the idea for John Doe, the serial killer. The choice to make John's identity a mystery was an intentional one, both by the screenwriter and by John Doe himself. His message carries more weight if it's not tied to one lonely, angry guy and the details of his lame life. There is a lot that goes unsaid or unseen in Se7en. We never actually see John Doe commit any of his murders in the movie. We only see photographs and quick snapshots of the aftermath of his crime. Walker explained the choice to leave an air of mystery around John Doe like this. There's lots of evil out there, and you're not always going to get the satisfaction of having any sort of understanding of why that is. That's one of the things that scares people the most about serial killers. The city that Se7en takes place in is also left intentionally vague. It is obviously inspired by New York City, and at one point Mill's wife Tracy mentions moving from upstate, which is a common way to refer to upstate New York, which I've never heard for any other state, which is kind of weird now that I think about it, but there are also purposeful anomalies. For example, the final scene takes place in a desert not far outside the city, but no such desert exists near New York. Yet. The police cars and uniforms are vague and only say Metropolitan on them. John Doe's jumpsuit says Bardock County Jail. Bardock County isn't a real place, but it is the last name of someone who worked in the wardrobe department. A road sign shows the city was incorporated in 1926, which makes it 69 years old in 1995. Nice. It has a population of 8.3 million. New York City's population was 7.3 million at the time, so it's clear that Se7en takes place in a totally made-up city that could exist almost anywhere in the United States. It could be your city. The other major mystery at the time of the movie's release was the identity of the actor who portrayed John Doe. Kevin Spacey's name was not listed in the opening credits, and Spacey didn't do any publicity for the film before its release. Spacey was a star at the time, so it was a highly unusual move. All this is to say, the mystery surrounding the movie and the character of John Doe added to the movie's mystique at the time it was released. The movie stood alone for over a decade as the only source of information on John Doe. But in 2006, Zenescope Entertainment published a comic book series based on the movie, also called Se7en. The comic book is a licensed adaptation of the movie and is non-contradictory, so we will count it as canon and reference it heavily throughout this video. The comic book is mostly told from John's perspective. It includes a lot of background information on his past, as well as insights into his mind. The comic books feature some of the pages from the extensive journals John Doe kept. By his own calculations, John Doe filled up at least 2,000 notebooks containing 250 pages each. He was a prolific yet scatterbrained writer. Detective Somerset discovers these journals in the movie, and in the comic book, John sends Somerset a confession that he refers to as his Book of Longing. There are a lot in these pages that aren't in the movie. The journals literally show us John's inner monologue. They give us an insight into his motivations, his thoughts on modern society, and his tireless obsession with the 7 deadly sins. John Doe was notorious for punishing those he felt had committed one of the 7 deadly sins. But did you know that there's actually an 8th deadly sin? Well, okay, it's not deadly, but it is something that you don't want to be in. And I'm talking about debt. That's why today's video is sponsored by PDS Debt. PDS Debt has customized options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. Much like John Doe's gluttony victim, debt is a problem that will keep growing if you ignore it. If you're making payments every month on your debt and your balances aren't going down, this program is for you. But CZ, how does it work? PDS Debt provides options that consolidate your debts into one low monthly payment. PDS Debt is a top-rated company on Google and has an A+ rating on the BBB. And those guys don't mess around. Everyone with $10,000 or more in eligible debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. If you don't want your debt following you like a seasoned detective, this is the option for you. Right now, PDS Debt is offering a free debt analysis. It only takes 30 seconds, so you might as well do it, because ignoring the problem hasn't worked, has it? Head over to pdsdebt.com/CZsWorld and get your free debt assessment today. The link will be in the description. The 7 deadly sins, listed from most to least deadly, are pride, greed, lust, wrath, gluttony, envy, and sloth. They aren't listed together like this in the actual Christian Bible, although the Apostle John, one of Jesus' first disciples who took a prominent role in guiding the early Christian church, does make the distinction between mortal and not mortal sin. If you see any brother or sister commit a sin that does not lead to death, you should pray and God will give them life. I refer to those whose sin does not lead to death. There is a sin that leads to death. I am not saying that you should pray about that. All wrongdoing is sin, and there is sin that does not lead to death. That is an overly wordy way of saying some sins are worse than others. As Christianity spread in the early years, Christians and Christian scholars sought to define these sins more clearly for themselves, so that they could understand them and avoid committing them.
The sins were used in medieval sermons. 7 cardinal virtues and 7 deadly sins used as teaching tools.
The first person to list 7 deadly sins was Tertullian of Carthage, who died around the year 220 CE. Later, a monk named Evagrius Ponticus made a list of 8 evil thoughts that closely resemble the 7 deadly sins we know today. He left out envy and included sorrow and vainglory in his list. This is the first time I've heard sorrow as a sin. Didn't know Ponticus went that hard. And vainglory is basically excessive vanity, which seems a little bit too close to pride, but we'll cut Ponty some slack since he was still working out the list. Pope Gregory the Great, no, I do not know if he named himself that or if someone else named him that, gave us the list that we know today around the year 600. He made his list to define the sins which break the union between man and God. He listed them in the order of their severity. Pride was the deadliest because it is wholly self-centered, while lust was the least deadly of the 7 because it at least involves another one of God's creations. So there you go. Lust isn't as bad as pride, but from what I understand, both will earn you a one-way ticket to hell according to the Catholic Church. We know that John studied the writings of Thomas Aquinas in high school because he quotes Aquinas in an argument about free will. Aquinas wrote a lot about sin in the 1200s in his work Summa Theologica, which translates to, you guessed it, Summary of Theology. He wrote a lot about the nature of sin and what causes man to sin. He believed that the devil could only tempt humans to sin, and that humans ultimately had the free will to choose the sinful or righteous path. John believed this too, and like Thomas Aquinas, he believed that men could and should be punished for their sins by humans and human law. John was also familiar with the Parson's Tale from Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tale, which is arguably the most famous work about the 7 deadly sins, including the anime. The Parson's Tale not only defines the 7 deadly sins, but it also names the cardinal virtues: humility, contentment, patience, fortitude, mercy, moderation, and chastity. Those may sound like the names of the most boring 7 dwarves imaginable, but the idea was that by living these virtues, one could avoid and make up for their sins. John Doe, however, chose violence. John grew up Catholic and attended Catholic schools, so he was familiar with these sins. His overall mission was to highlight these sins in modern society so that everyone would see him make an example of the sinner. He was a good student and an avid reader. He quoted the Bible and some of the works I just mentioned in his journals and at his crime scene. But if we want to fully understand John and his motivations, we need to talk about his tumultuous childhood and his abusive mother. John's mom instructed him to stay away from Marcy McFadden after she walked in on him spying on her through the bathroom window. She called him a sinner and told him not to talk to her. Around the same time, a man John referred to as Uncle Tim was visiting. Uncle Tim pulled John aside after this incident to warn him that he was on a path to hell before sending him off to Bible study. By the way, it is worth noting that Uncle Tim calls him John, which tells us that John Doe's first name is actually John. On his way to Bible study, John once again crossed paths with his neighbor, Marcy, and warned her that, according to his mother, she was going to hell for being a dirty whore, which is certainly an interesting way to talk to a girl you like. This is where John's relationship with his mother changes. Marcy called John's mom a hypocrite and informed him that Uncle Tim was in town for more than just a friendly visit, and that he had been sent to Bible study so that his mother and Uncle Tim could have some time alone. John went home, peeked through the windows, and saw with his own eyes that his mother was a hypocrite. Soon after this, John's mom caught him looking through her underwear drawer. She punished him in the most confusing and Freudian way possible and then lashed him with a belt. A little while later, John found a note from Marcy telling him to meet her behind a church, but when he showed up, he found her dead on the ground with her underwear around her ankles. John later asked his mom how someone could do that to Marcy, and she told him that Marcy was punished by God, and that she would do whatever she had to protect him. So it is strongly implied that she was the one to punish Marcy for her sins, and this apparently had an influence on John because he would eventually take it upon himself to punish those that he considered to be sinners. This story tells us about John's personal experience with lust, and it also suggests that John isn't the only murderer in his family. The irony, of course, is that John's mother and Uncle Tim were committing the very same sin that they punished Marcy for. But John's mother wasn't the only source of pain in his young life. He also suffered from cluster headaches. He describes the cluster headaches as episodic, somewhat phantom bouts of cephalalgia, far more excruciating than migraines, like lightning. John treated these headaches with lithium at first. When the lithium treatment stopped working, a doctor recommended that they try electroshock therapy. Electroshock therapy was most commonly used to treat psychological disorders like depression or schizophrenia in the 60s and 70s, but not cluster headaches. So either John's doctor was a quack, or maybe he recognized a deeper psychological problem in John. Either way, he promised John that the procedure would not be painful, and that turned out to be a lie. Ironically, headaches are actually one of the more common side effects of electroshock therapy. John often referred to his headaches as lightning in his head. He battled it throughout his life, and even while in the midst of his murders. In one journal entry from his adult years, he describes a headache like this: "Almighty God, my head. My fucking head feels like a whirring power station at the center of a fathoming whirlpool. I sense the blood vessels expand behind my left ear. I taste the lukewarm stomach enzymes weaving up my trachea." Later on, John writes a couple times about throwing up at seemingly random times. It's possible these bouts of nausea were also caused by his cluster headaches. John would get another chance at love shortly after in high school, but this time he would see his mother's rage firsthand. The next known story from John's childhood occurred during high school. Again, he was smitten by a girl in his class, Katie Dwyer. John was called out for not paying attention by a teacher who thought he was distracted by his concupiscence. Ah yes, concupiscence. I definitely know what that word means, but just in case you don't, I'm gonna look it up. It's a word Catholics use to describe lusting after someone, specifically the human tendency to sin. St. Augustine, a very influential Roman philosopher and theologian in the 4th and 5th centuries, specifically used it to describe a tendency towards sinful lust. The teacher asked John a question about Thomas Aquinas, the Apostle John, and their contradictory definitions of free will. The intention was to stump him, but John was not stumped. He fired back with a long quote, even offering to recite it in Latin. Obviously, this is John showing off a bit, but it's also the first indication that he knows his theology and the Bible. Or at least I assume he knows his stuff. I don't know anything about Christianity outside of what I've researched in order to make my videos. It comes up surprisingly a lot in the horror genre. Feels like I'm always talking about some religious reference. Probably my fault for making like 20 Conjuring videos though. But John's encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible impressed Katie enough that she invited him to come over to her place to study later that evening. John was on cloud 9, so he did what any young teen would do in that situation. He went home to journal and pray about it. Okay, that's not what most teens would do, but it probably is more respectable than bragging about his dub in the group chats. When he arrived home, he discovered his mom's half-finished liquor bottles and poured them down the sink, then went to his room to write sort of an open love letter to the Lord. This is what he wrote: "You, my Lord, have brought Katie into my life for a reason. It is through her light and yours that I will see my way through the darkness. She's nothing like that slut who seduced me and ravaged my soul. But that one is gone now, done in by her own sins. No, I mustn't speak of that one anymore. I am not the same person anymore. I am humble. I am pure. My heart has grown. My soul has been reborn. Thanks to you and Katie. In the midst of his journaling, John's mom returned home with a new, strange man and discovered her freshly emptied liquor bottles, causing her to barge straight into John's room, beat him with a shoe, and lock him away, causing him to miss his study date with Katie. Days later, John caught up with Katie after his class, and this time she invited herself over to his house. They went to John's room to study, only to discover his mother, drunk again, sitting on his bed reading through his journal. John's mom read his journal out loud for Katie, who understandably fled the scene. John's mom beat him over the head with the bottle, causing him to bleed. She also mentions John's dad, because apparently he too kept journals and secrets of his own before leaving the family. This is the only time John's father is ever mentioned. I'm kind of having a moment of deja vu. There are a lot of parallels here between John's mom and Margaret White, the mother of Carrie White from Stephen King's Carrie, who I covered previously on Horror History. Margaret White was also a single mother with huge resentments towards the father of her child. At one point, she caught Carrie staring at a sunbathing neighbor and punished her harshly for it by locking her in a closet to pray. John didn't end up being telekinetic, and Carrie didn't live to be an adult, but both of their mothers were religious zealots with a tendency towards violence. It's worth noting that John's mom seemed to change quite a bit between his middle school and high school years. He isn't surprised to find her liquor bottles around the house, which is why before he brings Katie over, he goes in to make sure the coast is clear first. He even called it out directly when his mom barged into his room for the first time. "Drinking is wrong, mama. You used to say it yourself before you turned into a whore." She also looked different. She wore a loose-fitting shirt, which is a little risque coming from the woman who called Marcy a filthy whore for wearing a skirt. Honestly, she's looking more unhinged than a Coraline theorist YouTuber. We know from his journals that John thinks of Marcy's death as something that he shouldn't talk about anymore, which seems odd. If her death was a moral lesson, then why shouldn't it be discussed? His mom's turn from the pious, conservatively dressed, holier-than-thou mom to promiscuous party girl seems like a sharp one. After high school, John served in the Marine Corps. We know this because as part of his effort to hide his identity, he sliced off a Semper Fidelis tattoo on his upper right arm, a seal meant to signify faithfulness to the Marine Corps. John is of the age where he might have served in Vietnam, but we really have no way of knowing that. John got a law degree at some point too. He mentioned it before he threw it in a box and destroyed it along with any other possessions that could have revealed his identity. Later on, as an adult, he worked as a lawyer for an insurance company, where he was fired for showing sympathy for a surviving family who had filed a claim after a fire. You know, the main point of having insurance. John felt the family had a legitimate claim, but his boss was more concerned about corporate profits. It's hard to glean too much from this, except that John always had some sense of morality, and that he was sane enough to hold down a job, at least for a little while. John was also married at one point to a woman named Mary. We know this from a tattoo of her name that he later removed from his arm. At one point, John and his wife had a son who died as an infant, but we don't know the exact circumstances of this child's life or death. John only mentioned this son once in passing, as he prepared to burn a pair of baby shoes in the aforementioned box full of possessions that could identify him. It seems that after having this first child, Mary became infertile, and as a result, John wouldn't touch her or be intimate with her after they discovered that she couldn't bear children. This is another example of John interpreting Catholic teachings in the most extreme way possible. The Catholic Church teaches that the procreation is the primary purpose of sex, and it forbids the use of contraceptives or birth control of any kind. However, the church does not forbid married couples from having sex if procreation is unlikely or impossible. It just requires that the couple not interfere with God's will with the use of contraception. Long story short, John cockblocked himself for no reason, just to be extra pious. We don't know much more about the marriage, except that it ended after he caught her in bed with another man, apparently unable to bear the lack of intimacy. Normally, a marriage, birth of a child, death, and divorce would be huge milestones and misfortunes in a person's life. But in this case, they're hardly mentioned and don't appear to affect him very much on the surface. But that doesn't mean that they aren't eating away at him, and they would come back in a big way. Sometime after losing his wife and losing his job, John went back to his mother's house, where he found her burning every last trace of him and his childhood years. She didn't hold back on him either. She called him the gluttonous unborn parasite stealing off my womb, the greedy infant incessantly retching through my exhausted hands. John told her that he had nowhere to go, and she disowned him, which was enough to cause a crisis of faith in him. He removed his cross necklace and tossed it into the fire. Somehow, in doing this, the flames grew out of control and consumed his mom. He grabbed a key from around her neck and walked away as both his mom and childhood home burned to the ground. Funny enough, Margaret White also burned alive in her home at the hand of her child. The only difference is, in that case, Carrie burned with her. John later went to the bank where he used his mother's key to open a safety deposit box. When he opened the box, he laughed hysterically. Unfortunately, we don't know for sure what was inside that box.
Oh, what's in the box?
Some have speculated that it had something to do with the 7 deadly sins. I think it could have been some sort of confession or evidence that his mother or Uncle Tim had killed Marcy, but we simply don't know. Whatever it was, it marked a turning point for John. He had no child, no wife, and finally, no mother. Once he opened that box, he went from being John, the ordinary citizen, to John Doe, the ideological serial killer. John began preparing for his murders long before he committed any crimes. Around 1990, 5 years before the body of his first victim was discovered, he opened a bank account with cash. Then he began the process of erasing his own identity to ensure that it would never be connected to any of his crimes. It was important for him for his John Doe persona to be seen as a messiah of sorts. Not only did it add to his mystique and the fear that he instills in people, but he's trying to portray himself as almost kind of a religious figure. Many major religions have a messiah who is known only by first name with sparse details about their actual lives. In Islam, that's Muhammad. In Judaism, an example could be Moses, and in Hinduism, they have Krishna. Even fictional cults that I've talked about on this channel follow suit. Jigsaw was meant to be an idea that lived on after his death in the Saw franchise. Kira's identity was kept hidden from the public in Death Note. So naming himself John Doe was an attempt to get people to see him as an idea, not as a man. He wrote about his work in a journal called The Confession, My Book of Longing, where he documented the process of stripping himself of his identity to become John Doe, and he spoke with a lot of clarity about the reasons that he had to remain anonymous. If you cannot track my history and identity, your behaviorists and psychologists and profilers cannot confine my actions as effects of my childhood or various mistreatments or misfirings of synapses. You must indeed face the truth, the awesome and horrifying truth of the meaning of the actions, unclouded by labels and reasons and theories that you can pin on a single individual. The more you study me and my actions, the more you will find the true ugliness and horror of yourselves. The more you look for me, the more you will find your own ugly world staring back at you. Sometime between the end of his marriage in the 1980s and 1994, John sliced off his fingerprints and tattoos. He would continue to slice off his fingerprints for the rest of his life. Say what you want about the guy, but he was committed to his work. He would hold on to the box of earthly possessions for a while, but with his fingerprints gone and his identity gone, he was ready to get to work. John's victims are all discovered throughout the week of July 13 through 19 of 1995, but his plan went into action at least 1 year prior to that in 1994 when he overheard a man named Teddy speaking to his lawyer, Eli Gould, in a bar. Eli had gotten Teddy off the hook for whatever he did. The only thing we know about the crime is that the opposing lawyer called Teddy a pederast. When John overhears Teddy asking him what a pederast is, Eli tells him, "It's what you are, Mr. Allen." So basically, this lawyer, Eli Gould, knowingly defended a pedo. This was a detail that John Doe would not forget. John noticed signs of drug use on Teddy's body, the pockmarks from crystal meth, the scars from hypodermic needles, and the eroded nasal cartilage from cocaine use. He saw this as an opening. John was experiencing more of his cluster headaches, so he asked the bartender for an aspirin in front of Teddy. The bartender refused, but Teddy was more than willing to help. John followed Teddy back to his apartment and witnessed him make a drug deal along the way. When they arrived at Teddy's apartment, John searched the medicine cabinets for aspirin and found a treasure trove of drugs along with an unemployment check. John had seen all he needed to see. Teddy was an unemployed drug dealer, a pedophile, and a leech on the system. We know from his extensive journals that John had strong feelings about laziness and sloth. He wrote about Belphegor, the chief demon of sloth in Christian tradition. John described Belphegor in his journals as sloth incarnate and wrote, "Beware Belphegor. Beware his name and all variations of it, all likenesses of it, all suggestions of it." Belphegor was also a character in Paradise Lost, an epic poem by the English poet John Milton in the 17th century. Paradise Lost is about the fall of man and the devil's temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Like John Milton, John Doe believed that humans were responsible for their own salvation or downfall through their own choices. He aimed to remain vigilant in the face of temptation, and he viewed the battle against sloth as a personal one, writing in his journal, "I will remain diligent, for diligence occupies the opposite role as sloth. I will remain zealous, for zeal stands guard against sloth at the entry to the pearled kingdom. I will maintain my spiritual relationship with the Almighty and champion his cause and be his instrument, for refusing to do so is slothful." So not only did John view slothfulness as a sin, he also thought that allowing sloth to creep into his life would make him more susceptible to sin in all of its form. And he may actually have a point there, which is why I've been listing out all of my daily accomplishments on my Instagram story every night. It keeps me diligent, because if I don't get a lot done, then everyone sees it. That's why I do that. It's more about self-motivation than actual entertaining content. Apparently it's been motivating for others as well. And I bring this up to show how John could have fought the deadly sins without committing sins himself. Of course, his sloth victim was a much worse person than the guy who spends all day scrolling X Twitter. Or is he? John also wrote a lot about his battles with cluster headaches in these journal pages on Sloth. He described working on a pommel horse until his body begged him to stop, but he chose to endure it like a crucifixion. He also recalls a time where he was battling a cluster headache on the street when a beggar approached him asking for money. He refers to the woman disdainfully as a goat, who'd made the steadfast choice to do nothing. John ignored her pleas and retreated to a stairwell, prepared to vomit. The woman followed him and ran headfirst into a tree branch. When she began bleeding profusely, John delighted in her pain. Interestingly, the woman's pain and cries for help actually soothed John. His headache went away and he no longer felt sick. This is the only indication we get that John's murders are motivated by anything other than religious zeal. This suggests that John may actually find physical relief from his headaches through the suffering of others, specifically the suffering of sinners. I hope it goes without saying, don't do that. Speaking from personal experience, cut out caffeine entirely. It'll suck for a couple weeks, but if you stay off it, it's worth not having the headaches anymore pretty much ever. I also think avoiding processed foods has helped me as well. Personal anecdote aside, back to Teddy's apartment. John confronted the man about his drug dealing and offered him a lot of cash for an arrangement between the two of them. We don't know what Teddy thought the arrangement was, but John offered enough cash so that he wouldn't have to work for a year. Teddy accepted, and John injected the first dose of what he called Teddy's last trip and testament. John would keep Teddy drugged up and barely alive for a full year, until the rest of his plan would come to fruition. John's first victim was discovered on Monday, July 13th, 1995. We know this because the crime scene photographs from John's Tuesday crime scene, spoiler alert, are labeled with the date July 14, 1995. Now I know those of you out there with Rain Man brain are screaming, but how can this be? July 13th, 1995 was a Thursday. And you are correct, the timeline from the movie does not exactly match our real life calendar. Just as Se7en takes place in an unnamed city, a lot like New York City, the calendar in this universe is off by 3 days. Or maybe the art department just didn't anticipate that someone like me would be poring over every frame of this movie on a computer almost 30 years later, trying to figure out exactly when the crimes took place. But we all know that's impossible because the art department are perfect angels. Either way, John's first victim was a morbidly obese man who was targeted for committing the sin of gluttony. We don't know how or why John chose this man in particular, but we do know that he got to the man by tempting him. John showed up disguised as a pizza delivery man with the wrong address, eventually convincing him to take and eat his specialty pizza topped with cheese, pepperoni, and the secret ingredients, sedatives. I love the idea of the usually unflappable John pretending to be a pizza delivery guy. It's a me, Pasquale. No, I didn't order anything. No, I bring the pizza. You eat the pizza. I hope you all cherish that. I'm only allowed to bring my Italian voice out every couple of years. The man passed out, and when he woke up, John forced him to eat plates of spaghetti at gunpoint. What? You don't like my spaghetti? You're gonna die. Okay, I'm done. The man went in and out of consciousness and begged John to let him stop eating, but John wouldn't let up. It's estimated that this feeding sesh went on for more than half a day.
Coroner said this could have gone on for more than 12 hours.
John may have even left at one point to buy more food. We know this because Detective Somerset found 2 separate receipts in the grocery bags at the crime scene.
In the grocery bags, we found 2 receipts.
Or maybe the first store that he went to just didn't have enough spaghetti. John also forced the man to eat pieces of plastic along with his pasta. The man eventually threw up and passed out. According to the detectives, that's when John kicked the man, causing his stomach to basically explode inside of him. The official cause of death was internal hemorrhaging and a hematoma in the abdominal muscles. John left a message for the detectives behind the refrigerator at the crime scene. He scrawled the word gluttony onto the wall and left a note that read, "Long is the way and hard that out of hell leads up to light." This quote is from Paradise Lost by John Milton, the epic poem that I mentioned earlier about the temptation of Adam and Eve by Lucifer. The specific quote is a line that Satan says when none of his fallen angels are willing to make the journey out of hell back to earth. Satan opts to make the journey himself, and this quote is meant to underscore the sheer depths of hell and how far the angels have fallen. It suggests that the path to redemption will be a long and difficult one. John's inner dialogue gives us a clue as to why he chose this particular quote. There is so much sin in the world. It chokes and suffocates the lives of all it touches. It blankets the city in a shroud of endless despair and death, an empty promise made by humanity to a God that has long been forgotten. So it falls on me to make them remember. It falls on me to bring them out of the dark and into the light. John truly believed that he was doing the Lord's work. John was not remorseful for his first kill. In fact, he was proud of it. He wrote in his journal, "Today I killed a man. I looked upon my works and saw it was good." He was just getting started with his demonstrations of atonement. With 1 deadly sin down, 6 more were on the table. Not the spaghetti table, just the metaphorical table. John's next victim was the defense lawyer who successfully defended Teddy the pederast, Eli Gould. See, I told you he wouldn't forget. Mr. Gould's body was found in his office on the morning of Tuesday, July 14th after a long weekend. John was very specific about his reasons for targeting Gould. Eli makes millions of dollars each year. Murderers, rapists, and drug dealers go free, and he reaps the reward. He lies with every single breath that he takes in order to put them back on the street, only to line his already overflowing pockets. The scales of justice have become unbalanced, weighed down by the greed of this man. Today, the balance will be restored, set right by the flesh and blood of the sinner. John was familiar with Gould's work. He'd been following it personally for quite some time. He was present in the courtroom when Gould successfully defended a mobster, murderer, and drug trafficker named Mr. Kusnov. John watched from a distance as Gould worked with his slumlord clients and the police to evict a mother and her children from their home. He witnessed the mother reach out to Eli for mercy, and Eli's ice-cold response, telling her to get her hands off his coat. Just to make sure that he knew who he was dealing with, John booked a one-on-one meeting with Eli just a week prior to his murder. John pretended to be a man being framed for a crime, claiming that he'd been attacked and hospitalized. He proclaimed his innocence and asked if Eli could take a payment plan. Eli had his secretary remove John from his office. Just a week later, on Friday afternoon, just as everyone was wrapping up their work week, John disguised himself as a custodian, pistol-whipped Eli, and took him prisoner in his own office. It would be a long weekend for Eli Gould, but also his last. It turns out the Bible has a lot more to say about greed than it does about gluttony, and John wrote down some of the verses that inspired him to punish Eli in his journal. Isaiah 56:11 talks about the nature of greed. Yeah, they are greedy dogs that can never have enough. They are so wicked that they cannot understand their own way, everyone for his own gain and his own advantage. And Isaiah 57:17 talks about how God feels about greed. I was enraged by his sinful greed. I punished him and hid my face in anger, yet he kept on in his willful ways. John took his time punishing Eli Gould. He held him hostage and tortured him from late night on Friday, July 10th, all the way through Monday, July 13th, when the law office was closed. John didn't even kill the maligned attorney. He made Eli do the deed himself by handing him a butcher's knife and ordering him to cut off a pound of his own flesh at gunpoint. This very specific punishment was inspired by Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. In the play, a moneylender named Shylock demands that the rich and greedy Antonio give up a pound of his own flesh if he's unable to pay back his debts. Shylock demands this because he wants revenge on Antonio for treating him so inhumanely in the past. The expression pound of flesh is often used figuratively to describe a ruthless or unreasonable demand, often made at great personal cost to the person who owes it. But in this case, John Doe, like Shylock, literally wanted 1 pound of flesh. But unlike Shylock, John Doe got it. He even checked the exact amount by weighing it on a scale. As Eli bled out, John wrote greed on the floor of the office in blood, along with a note referencing the Merchant of Venice. 1 pound of flesh, no more, no less. No cartilage, no bone, but only flesh. This task done, and he would go free. Ironically, he's not the only John I've talked about on this channel who asked his victim to cut off a pound of flesh as reference to the old saying, as this was also the basis for a trap in Saw 6. And like John from the Saw franchise, he's not just torturing them. He's putting them through what Somerset refers to as forced contrition. Contrition is defined as the state of feeling remorseful or penitent for your sins against God. John Doe forced Eli to confront his sins. Eli begged for mercy, offered to help everyone, and even promised to ask for God's forgiveness if John spared his life. He wanted Eli to feel sorry for sins that he didn't even realize he was committing. By doing this, he's trying to play God. He made sure that his victims knew that they were being targeted before he handed down his punishment. And then, he made spectacles of his crime spree for the whole world to see. Before he left Gould's office, John used the severed hand of another one of his victims to spell out "help me" in fingerprints on the wall. These fingerprints belonged to Teddy Allen, the pedophile and drug addict that John had taken captive 1 year earlier. The fingerprints would lead the detectives to Teddy's home, the site of perhaps John's most gruesome punishment of all. We don't have all the details on how John drugged Teddy or what exactly was done to him in the year before the detectives discovered the body on Thursday, July 16th. John kept him inactive for about a year and hung air fresheners all over the apartment to alleviate the stench of what was essentially a living corpse, which some of you need to do. Just saying. Based on what the detectives and the coroner said, we know that John gave Teddy antibiotics to keep his bed sores from getting infected, and that Teddy chewed off his own tongue long before police discovered him. John somehow kept him alive that entire time, much to the surprise of the detectives who found him. John had put him through hell, cutting off his hand and even a few toes. The coroner described Teddy's brain as mush and claimed that a flashlight in his eyes could send him into shock.
He's experienced about as much pain and suffering as anyone I've encountered, give or take.
Yet again, John left no fingerprints or traces trace of himself at the crime scene, but he wasn't far away. He was actually keeping an eye on the detectives as they investigated. They even came face to face for a moment when John disguised himself as a photographer and crashed the crime scene with his camera. This was John's first taste of Detective Mill's wrath, but it wouldn't be his last. The two would come face to face outside of John's home just one day later. John was a voracious reader. He used the library and read a ton of books on religion, crime, Catholicism, and the 7 deadly sins. Detective Somerset used his connections at the FBI to illegally look up library users who had checked out books like Paradise Lost, The Canterbury Tales, and other books on crime and the 7 deadly sins. Surprisingly, this tactic worked, and these records led Detective Mills and Detective Somerset to John's apartment, where they paid him an unexpected, unofficial police visit just one day later. The detectives came to talk, but John wasn't interested in talking. He did get shot in the leg trying to escape the cop duo, and this slowed him down a bit, but he still managed to get away and incapacitate Mills with a swift blow to the head in a back alley. John held a gun to Mills' head, but ultimately decided to let him live before running away. John would remind Mills about this act of mercy just a few days later. This was not a part of John's plan, but it would be the last time the detectives had the upper hand on it. John's apartment doesn't tell us much that we didn't already know. He kept a variety of scalpels, knives, hammers, and other instruments of torture. He had a lot of Catholic memorabilia like rosary beads, crosses, and a Bible. Of course, they found a drawer full of empty aspirin bottles for the headaches. He kept mementos and photographs from his crime scenes, and most notably, there were the journals. 2,000 notebooks at 250 pages each to be exact, every page filled. John got in touch with the detectives by calling his own number in the middle of their investigation to express his admiration for them, and to let them know that his work was not done. The very next day, Saturday, July 18th, John went to a sex club called the Hot House. He was disgusted by the place, so much so that he vomited in the bathroom. He wrote his thoughts down in his journal. The stench of her cheap perfume, the foulness of this place. The bile rises in my throat. I expel the filth that infects my body, the filth of these sinners that surround me. I'm starting to think we could create a whole game out of this. Is this a John Doe journal entry or Fall Out Boy lyric? John collected himself and followed a married man and sex worker into a private room. He came prepared for this moment with a custom-built leather apparatus that he'd commissioned specifically for this very occasion. The device was basically a strap-on with a knife. According to the very traumatized man, John secured the strap-on to him, stuck a gun down his throat, and forced him to do the deed with this woman. This was arguably John's most sadistic act, and it's also the one that we know the least about. It seems that unlike his other victims, John didn't do as much research on these two. And I have to wonder if that has something to do with his turbulent relationship with lust from his childhood, being punished by his mom for his feelings towards the neighbor girl. He was essentially conditioned by her to see lust as a repulsive quality. He probably viewed everybody in the place as a sinner worthy of God's harshest punishment. He saw the entire city as being lost to their venereal impulses. In his journals, he compared his city to Sodom and Gomorrah, a pair of cities destroyed by God in the Bible. They have forgotten the example. The fire and brimstone that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah no longer resonates. The sinners must be reminded. Sinners will be purified by fire, purified by the pain. In other words, John wanted to inflict pain on the people of his city and make them aware of his wickedness, the same way the God of the Old Testament rained sulfur and fire down upon Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. He took the sin of lust and promiscuity very seriously, maybe because of his religious upbringing, his mother's behavior, or maybe he was still hurt after his wife cheated on him. Whatever the case, John didn't dwell on these victims for very long. While the detectives were investigating this crime scene, he went to church, and in his mind, he received God's blessing straight from the mouth of Jesus. Or at least, that's how he perceived it. The alternative is that he really did have schizophrenia. Later that afternoon, John used a press credential to get on the set of a photo shoot featuring supermodel Rachel Shade. His credential was checked in by a real person, which suggests it at least looked real or maybe was legitimate. This could mean that John was a member of the press at some point, or maybe he's just the original master of disguise. Either way, he got in to watch the photo shoot and witnessed Rachel's entitled behavior firsthand from the sidelines. She berated her photographer, screamed at her assistant, and also proved to be a horrible mother, which was a sore spot for John for obvious reasons. At one point, she left a screaming voicemail to her ex-husband in front of her daughter, telling him to take her for the night so that she could attend a party. John had a particular disdain for Rachel and her sin, pride. As I mentioned before, pride is considered to be the most deadly of the 7. John called it the sin from which all others arise. This is consistent with the teachings of Pope Gregory the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, and the general teachings of the Catholic Church. John writes in his journal that pride was the original sin committed by Lucifer. Lucifer believed that he was equal to God and rebelled against God along with some other angels. When he was defeated, he was cast into hell for his sins. John also wrote about the fall of man in his journals. He called Eve a self-obsessed whore and claimed that because of Adam and Eve's pride, he was a soldier against the weakness befallen the world. It's fair to guess that John got a lot of these ideas from Paradise Lost as well. Pride is considered the gateway sin. If you believe that you're better than people and God, you're more likely to act out, mistreat people, and do whatever you please without fear of consequence. Needless to say, John recognized the vanity and pride in Rachel Shade's behavior, and he set out to punish her for it. That same night, John found his way into the party that Rachel mentioned earlier and decided to use her pride against her. Posing as a West Coast fashion photographer, he flattered her, calling her the most beautiful woman in the room, claiming to be a big fan. John's flattery paid off, and Rachel invited him back to her place for a photo shoot that same night. Upon arriving, he noticed that there were a lot of photos of Rachel around, but none of her daughter. He asked her about this, and Rachel told him, "Hush, don't spoil the moment. This night is about us." If her fate wasn't sealed before this, she certainly sealed it with that line. As she went to the bathroom to change, John followed her inside. Rachel was surprised but still flirty and asked John what he thought of her outfit. That's when John finally got honest with her. "I think you are a vile, loathsome creature, unfit to be a mother, unfit to be a human being, unfit to live." He injected her with some kind of sedative, shoved her in the bathtub, and cut off her nose. Probably the most hurtful thing you can do to someone whose apartment is filled with images of her own face. He laid her on the bed, glued a phone to her right hand and a bottle of sleeping pills to her left, giving her the choice to call for help and be disfigured for the rest of her life, or she could kill herself by taking the pills. Rachel chose to die with her daughter's teddy bear cradled in her arm. I'm sure she was probably in a lot of pain getting her nose cut off and everything, but I just can't wrap my head around that decision. I feel like my instinct would always be to live. Obviously the message is that she couldn't go on without her moneymaker looks. I guess I can't really relate because making my content doesn't rely on one thing in particular. Like if you disfigured my face, it would honestly just kind of fit in as a horror channel. Like this guy didn't let it stop him, so why would I? If I got my hands cut off, I'd have to do voice typing, but I'd figure it out. If I went blind, that would probably be the worst. I'd imagine I'd have to switch to deep diving audiobooks, but I would probably still do it. This is not an invite to disfigure me in any way, just to be clear. John was on a roll. It seemed he could not be stopped. That's why it was such a surprise to the investigators when the whole thing came to an end the very next day. At some point during John Doe's crime spree, he began studying his investigators. We already know he showed up at his own crime scenes disguised as a reporter and a police officer, but it turns out at some point during the week, he began spying on Detective Mills at home. That's when he discovered Mills' wife, Tracy. Throughout his life, love had always escaped John. From his childhood romances to his unhappy marriage to Mary, John could never get it right. But Mills, who John looks down on, had figured it out. As he watched Mills kiss his wife goodbye from across the street, he grew envious. The misfortunes that I alluded to at the beginning were finally coming back to haunt him. He became obsessed with Tracy. He interpreted this as the devil tempting him and trying to throw him off track with longing. So he did what any person would do in this situation. He removed his teeth with a pair of pliers and hammered them into powder. Okay, maybe that's not what anyone would do. I think we've established that he's not really a normal guy. He did this because he didn't want to be identified by his dental records, and possibly because he just loved the way he looked in dentures. On Sunday, July 19th, the morning after he cut off Rachel Shade's nose, John took the box filled with the belongings he treasured, the baby shoes, the wedding ring, the law degree, etc., and dumped them into an incinerator. He described it like this: "I cut the final tether. I have no past. I am human no more. I am only an idea. Now I just have this empty box." The box wouldn't be empty for long. Later that morning, John went to Detective Mills' apartment and rang for his wife. He introduced himself as Detective Johns and claimed that he worked with her husband. Tracy buzzed him in and poured him a cup of coffee. He said he was there to pick something up for Detective Mills, and in a way, he wasn't lying. We don't know exactly how he did it, but John murdered Tracy and decapitated her, placing her head in the box that once held all of his cherished possessions. Then he called a courier service to pick it up and deliver it to an unspecified location at 7 p.m. that day. Later that same morning, John took a cab to the police station where he calmly walked inside and turned himself in.
Detective!
You're looking for me.
John was arrested just like he'd planned. The detectives did everything they could to identify him, but came up empty. He enjoyed a cup of tea and worked with his lawyer to lay out the terms. Side note, he hired a good slimy defense attorney. Eli Gould would have been proud. John told his lawyer that there were 2 more bodies yet to be found and that he would take only Detective Mills and Detective Somerset to these bodies at 6 p.m. If they didn't agree, he would plead insanity and the bodies would never be found, but if they did agree, he would sign a full confession. Once again, John manipulated the situation perfectly to get what he wanted. Later that day, at 6 p.m., he rode in the back of a police car with Somerset and Mills and directed them seemingly to the middle of nowhere, where he was expecting the delivery. The detectives interrogated him along the way, and he gave a few key insights into his state of mind, such as why he made spectacles out of all of his crime scenes. He explained that he was not exceptional, but his work was.
People will barely be able to comprehend, but they won't be able to deny.
John spoke directly about his work during this car ride. He told Mills that he didn't choose this work, but that he was chosen. When Mills accused him of killing innocent people, he laid it all out on the table. That is, the metaphorical table again. He went through every person that he'd harmed and broke down the sins that they'd committed and the reason that they deserved to be punished. He laid out his thesis.
Only in a world this shitty could you even try to say these were innocent people and keep a straight face. But that's the point. We see a deadly sin on every street corner, in every home, and we tolerate it. We tolerate it because it's common. It's trivial. We tolerate it morning, noon, and night. Well, not anymore. I'm setting the example, and what I've done is going to be puzzled over and studied and followed forever.
And here we are, most of the way into a horror history video on him. He absolutely called it. Mills called John delusional, and that's when John turned his sights on the young detective to stir up his anger, to stir up his wrath. John taunted Mills for being bad at his job. He reminded him of the first time that they met, when John could have killed him.
You're only alive because I didn't kill you.
Okay, sit back.
I spared you.
Sit back.
Remember that, detective, every time you look in the mirror at that face of yours for the rest of your life. Or should I say, for the rest of what life I've allowed you to have.
Sit back, you fucking freak! Shut your fucking mouth!
John got the reaction he wanted. He led Mills and Somerset to the open desert where they got out of the car. John envisioned himself like Jesus, carrying his cross to his own crucifixion. The detectives, his Roman centurion. At just after 7 p.m., John's courier service arrived to the desert. Somerset went to meet the driver, and Mills stayed behind with the gun pointed at John's head. John took this opportunity to talk to Mills and explain himself.
When I said I admired you, I meant what I said.
John looked on as Detective Somerset received the delivery and discovered Tracy's severed head inside the box. John told Mills how he'd gotten his information posing as a member of the press and how he'd visited his wife that very morning.
I tried to play husband. I tried to taste the life of a simple man. It didn't work out. So, I took a souvenir. Her pretty head.
Mills understandably didn't take this news well, at first refusing to believe the reality of the situation. John kneeled calmly as Somerset tried to talk his partner out of doing what he was about to do.
Become vengeance, David.
Ah, she's all right, you tell me.
Become wrath.
John had Mills right where he wanted him, continuing to prod the detective's anger. Then he broke the news that he didn't even realize he was breaking.
She begged for her life.
Shut up.
And for the life of the baby inside of her.
In the last moments before Detective Mills shot a bullet through John Doe's head, he seemed almost serene, knowing that he had accomplished what he set out to do. After shooting John, making him the 7th and final victim of his own game, Mills fired a few more rounds into him for good measure. All of the 7 deadly sins had now been accounted for. Mills' sin was wrath, and John Doe was envy. The story was over. John left a little something extra for Somerset in the box along with Tracy's head, his notebook, the Book of Longing. My interpretation is that John knew that he was going to be envy all along, hence the title of his journal. Longing, envy, jealousness, covetousness, they're all different ways of expressing the sin that John felt that he had committed. In the notebook, there's a piece of wallpaper with a flower on it. We see this piece of wallpaper early on when Somerset is getting ready for work. In an early version of the Se7en script, Somerset took this wallpaper from a home in the countryside where he wanted to retire. This was one last message from John to the aging detective. He wanted to make sure that Somerset knew that he would always be one step ahead of him. Greetings, Detective Somerset. I trust you'll appreciate our time together. John Doe. John Doe was a misguided religious fanatic. The evils that he pointed out in the world around him and the people that he targeted were mostly deserving of ridicule, but John went a step further and resorted to violence. He set out to punish the sinners, but his larger mission was to highlight the sin that was accepted in modern society. By doing this, John likely thought that his murders and his message would actually end up saving souls by bringing people from the dark to the light, from sin to salvation. He went to his grave believing that he would make an impact, and seeing as how I know more people that have seen Se7en than have read the Canterbury Tales, he may have actually pulled it off. If you like this video, check out the episode I did on villains who kind of had a point. You'll find that video on the left. Remember to subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring the death bell, and select all notifications because missing an upload is the deadliest of sins, and I will see you in the next one. Assuming we both survive.